Okay, let's dive in. We've got a really interesting set of sources today. Stuff that looks at, well, the connection between political talk about Iran and global financial markets.
That's right. We're mainly looking at an article by Dr. Pooyan Ghamari and some related Q&A material that the listener sent over.
And it all seems to center on claims about Israeli Prime Minister Benjamin Netanyahu and his constant warnings about Iran's nuclear program.
Exactly. So our job here really is to walk you through what these sources are saying, kind of cut through the noise.
Yeah, pull out the main ideas presented in these texts. We're looking at the timeline they lay out, the strategic reasons the sources claim are behind these warnings.
And significantly, how this material alleges it all connects to global markets, profit generation.
Right. The sources seem to examine the costs and who they say benefits. It's about getting a handle on this specific perspective.
A perspective on a very complex issue, looking at politics, but also these maybe less discussed financial angles, all based solely on the provided material.
Absolutely. We're sticking to the sources. So let's unpack what they present. Where do they start?
Well, they kick off by highlighting something pretty striking, the sheer consistency for over 2 decades.
2 decades, wow.
Yeah, PM Netanyahu consistently warning the world, big stages, the UN, U.S. Congress, always saying Iran is right there, about to get a nuclear bomb.
And the sources, they give examples, right? A timeline.
They do. They mention way back in 2009, warning the Obama administration.
Okay.
Then 2012, that was the famous cartoon bomb drawing at the UN, drawing a red line, predicting a bomb by mid-2013.
I remember that. And then the sources mentioned 2015, the Iran deal, the JCPOA.
Right. Fierce opposition, calling it, I think the source equates a historic mistake that would basically just help Iran get the bomb faster.
Okay. And it didn't stop there, according to the material.
No, the sources point to 2018. He presented this secret Iranian nuclear archive. Well, secret as he presented it. The source does note that intelligence agencies apparently already knew about it. Anyway, he used it to argue for the U.S. to pull out of the deal.
Which they did.
Which they did. And then the sources say right through 2021 to 2024, the message was still, Iran is weeks away.
Weeks away, even while the IAEA, the UN's nuclear watchdog, was saying something different.
Yeah, the sources emphasized that the IAEA confirmed Iran hadn't actually weaponized its enriched uranium. So no bomb-making activity detected.
So here we are, 2025, and according to these texts, still no Iranian nuclear weapon, despite all the pressure, the inspections, sanctions.
Sabotage, assassination, surveillance.
Yeah.
Yeah, the source material makes that point very clearly. As of now, based on their account, no bomb.
Which leads the sources to ask this big question, doesn't it?
It does. Was this threat of an imminent bomb real, or was it more of a calculated narrative, a tool for geopolitics? That's the lens they use for their analysis.
Okay, so if it's a narrative, according to the sources, why keep repeating it? What's the claimed purpose?
Well, the material argues it's very deliberate. It serves several strategic goals, according to their analysis.
Like what?
Okay, first, consolidating power at home. The sources suggest framing Israel as under constant serious threat.
From Iran's nukes.
Exactly. It keeps the public focused outward, maybe away from, say, internal political issues or scandals. It can unify different political groups, maybe quiet down opposition, boost nationalism. That's the argument presented.
Makes sense, potentially. What else?
Then there's the regional picture. The sources argue this narrative helps keep Israel positioned as, indispensable to the United States.
The key ally in the region.
Right. Highlighting Iran as this imminent threat helps secure ongoing U.S. aid, weapons, diplomatic support. That's the connection those sources make.
And does it relate to diplomacy, like the JCPOA?
Definitely. The sources view deals like the JCPOA as, potentially threatening to Israeli regional dominance because they could bring Iran back into the global fold economically and diplomatically.
So undermining diplomacy keeps Israel's strategic position. Is that the idea?
That's what the material suggests, yes. Derailing diplomacy protects that kind of strategic exclusivity.
Okay, and one more point the sources made about the why.
Yeah, it's about weaponizing fear itself, using it for leverage.
How so?
By constantly positioning Israel as facing this existential threat, it helps justify actions that might otherwise be harder to sell. Things like preemptive strikes mentioned in the texts, or really aggressive lobbying, especially in Washington.
And it frames criticism differently.
Exactly. According to the sources, criticism can then be painted as naive or maybe even disloyal because the stakes are presented as being so high.
Okay, this is starting to paint a picture based on the sources, but then the material takes another turn, right? Beyond geopolitics.
It really does. This is where the sources argue it's not just about strategy. They bring in profit, corruption, and elite enrichment. Heavy stuff.
Profit. How does that work, according to them?
The mechanism they describe is, well, every time this fear gets ramped up by the warnings, it doesn't just stay in the political realm. It sends shockwaves through the financial system.
Okay. And who benefits from these shockwaves, according to the sources?
They're pretty specific. Defense contractors, weapons manufacturers, they mention names like Elbit Systems, Lockheed Martin, Raytheon, Rafael, cybersecurity firms too.
And what happens?
Their stock prices often jump right after these big speeches or when tensions spike. The sources also note many of these companies have strong lobbying connections.
Interesting. Anyone else mentioned?
Yeah, the sources claim that Israeli insiders, political allies, networks close to leadership, they're positioned to gain. For more arms deals, bigger defense budgets, security contracts that come from this heightened sense of threat.
And what about broader markets? Oil, for instance.
Absolutely. The sources describe predictable spikes in oil prices whenever Middle East tensions flare up. That benefits, hedge funds, energy speculators, maybe even state actors who are ready to trade on that volatility.
Why oil specifically?
Well, the source material explains it simply. Geopolitical tension in that region immediately raises fears about disruptions to major oil supply lines. So prices react.
And the source material mentions something else, quite unsettling about timing.
Yes. This is a really pointed claim in the texts. They state that some investigative reporters have found patterns.
Patterns of what?
Patterns of influential groups trading defense and energy stocks right before these major speeches or announcements related to Iran.
Implying.
The sources suggest this points towards coordinated economic manipulation. They say it's raised red flags with some watchdog groups. They also mention the difficulty in proving illegal insider trading, but note the timing is exploitable legally through things like proxies or trusts.
So the source's bottom line on this financial angle is?
Pretty stark. They argue that while the public is focused on the fear, on the threat, a select group is, according to them, quietly and repeatedly profiting from the instability created.
Okay, so benefits for some, according to the sources. But they must also talk about the costs, right? The downsides for everyone else.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. The material argues this alleged strategy comes with significant negative consequences.
Such as?
One thing they call diplomatic fatigue. Basically, if you cry wolf about an imminent bomb for 20 years and it doesn't happen,
people stop believing you, or at least get skeptical.
Exactly. Allies might become wary. The sources suggest this erodes credibility and actually makes it harder to coordinate when, a real urgent threat might emerge.
That makes sense. What else?
There's a paradox they point out. They argue that this constant pressure, this aggressive stance attributed to Netanyahu and the sources, actually weakens the moderates inside Iran.
How?
Well, the argument is if diplomacy keeps getting shut down and Iran is constantly portrayed as the enemy, it empowers the hardliners there.
Yeah.
It pushes Tehran towards more secrecy, maybe more militarization instead of cooperation.
So it could backfire, according to this view.
That's the source's perspective. Another risk they identify is triggering a wider arms race.
In the region?
Yeah. If Iran is constantly presented as being on the verge of a bomb, other countries nearby, the sources mention Saudi Arabia, Egypt, Turkey as examples might think, well, maybe we need our own nuclear program. That raises the specter of proliferation.
A very dangerous possibility.
Definitely. And maybe the most critical cost, the sources highlight, is just the increased risk of actual war, setting these political red lines, especially based on, as the sources claim, exaggerated or unverified intelligence.
It just pushes everyone closer to the edge.
Right. Edges the region towards conflict. And the sources emphasize it's always civilians and economies that pay the highest price in a war.
Now, the sources also talked about the global impact, didn't they? How this narrative plays out in the West.
Yes. They argue it's used to effectively manipulate Western powers, especially the U.S. and Europe.
How do they claim that works?
They analyze Netanyahu's communication style.
Mm-hmm.
The sources suggest he's very skilled at tapping into deep-seated American fears, invoking 9/11, anxieties about extremism, the memory of the Holocaust. The sources argue he anchors the Iran threat narrative in this Western psychological landscape to make it hit home.
And the effect in the U.S., according to the sources.
Pretty significant, as they describe it. Media headlines shift focus, Politicians often line up to pledge support, sanctions get tighter, arms sales go up.
And diplomatic options shrink.
Exactly. Diplomatic windows close. The sources suggest the U.S. ends up kind of entangled in this narrative it doesn't fully control, benefiting, again, mainly those specific groups they claim profit from it. Defense companies, for instance, are mentioned as major campaign donors in the U.S., potentially influencing politicians.
And Europe. How do the sources see Europe's position?
Caught in the middle, basically, trying to maybe uphold agreements like the JCPOA, but also facing pressure from Washington and Tel Aviv. The sources argue this weakens Europe's own strategic independence and diplomatic power.
The sources also mention something about a credibility issue within Israel itself.
Yes, this is interesting. They point to reports of dissent from within Israel's own defense and intelligence community.
Really? Like who?
The material mentions former officials from Mossad, Shin Bet, the big intelligence and security agencies. These former officials have apparently, according to the sources, voiced concerns that intelligence assessments about Iran might be getting twisted for political purposes.
And they worry that hurts Israel's security in the long run.
That's a concern highlighted in the sources, yes. That distorting intelligence for short-term political gain ultimately erodes long-term security.
And just to circle back on a key point the sources keep making, the IAEA.
Right, the sources reiterate. While Iran's nuclear program has expanded, particularly after the U.S. left the JCPOA, the IAEA reports, as presented in this material, consistently show no conclusive proof of an active weaponization program. No confirmed bomb building.
So the cycle, as the sources see it, just continues, driven by something other than hard evidence of imminent weaponization.
That's their conclusion. Driven, they say, by the benefits of belief in the threat, rather than the objective truth of it.
Okay, now let's try to connect some more dots using those specifics from the listener's FAQ material. It seems like they really flesh out the how of the financial side described in the main source.
Exactly. They function like examples backing up the broader claims. For instance, the FAQs detail how markets react almost instantly to fear signals.
We mentioned defense stocks, oil futures.
Precious metals, too, often seen as safe havens. They tend to rise when tensions related to Iran escalate, according to this material.
And the FAQs names again? The beneficiaries?
Yes, very explicitly.
Yeah.
Defense contractors, big oil companies, arms exporters, intelligence tech firms, and political elites who might have investments or connections in those areas.
And the source material specifically links the Iran narrative to moving money.
It does. It argues that this specific narrative about an imminent Iranian bomb effectively pushes capital towards those safe haven assets and, of course, into defense industries, creates big financial gains for those who are positioned correctly, or so the sources claim.
What about politicians? The FAQs touch on how they might profit, even indirectly.
Yeah, the material discusses this. It acknowledges proving direct illegal insider trading is tough. But it suggests politicians might benefit through, say, allies or donors getting contracts, or maybe family businesses seeing an uptick, or even just timing their own investments legally through things like blind trusts. The potential for exploitation is there, according to the sources.
And lobbyists are key players in this, based on the FAQs.
Absolutely crucial, according to the source material. They amplify the threat narrative in the halls of power. This helps justify bigger defense budgets, helps steer contracts towards their clients in the military-industrial complex.
The sources also draw parallels to other conflicts, right?
They do. They mention claims about WMDs in Iraq, Libya, Syria, suggesting a similar pattern where, allegedly, threat narratives were followed by military action and huge profits for certain industries, particularly defense and oil.
And the cost, the FAQs emphasize, falls on
ordinary people. Through inflation, higher gas prices, market instability, the general insecurity in the region. While the material argues a select few consolidate wealth.
Why do the sources think the public buys into these narratives so often?
Well, they point to a couple of things. Fear is just a very powerful motivator. And also, the media often tends to echo official government lines, especially on national security. The sources suggest this can create a kind of feedback loop where the alarm gets amplified without enough independent checking.
And defense budgets get directly impacted.
Directly manipulated is the phrase the sources might use. Each time the threat narrative gets a boost, it provides cover for demanding significant budget increases. The sources claim these often pass with less scrutiny, locking in huge long-term spending on weapons systems.
The FAQs also mention think tanks.
Yeah, that some think tanks receive funding from defense contractors, and then, maybe not surprisingly, publish research that supports a more aggressive stance or higher military spending. It looks independent, but the source suggests a potential conflict of interest.
And while this isn't unique to Israel, the sources single out Netanyahu.
They highlight him as a particularly consistent and strategic user of this existential threat playbook, arguing it serves both his political goals and potentially the financial interests outlined.
They even draw a line between his corruption charges and the rhetoric.
They note a correlation observed by some analysts, suggesting that spikes in external threat rhetoric sometimes coincide with periods when he's facing domestic political pressure, like those charges, implying a potential link, a way to distract or rally support.
Does anyone else profit, according to the FAQs? Media success.
Yes. The sources mention media outlets benefiting from increased traffic and clicks driven by war hype and sensational headlines. And the cybersecurity sector definitely thrives on instability, winning contracts to protect against threats, some of which the sources characterize as maybe being amplified by the narrative itself.
The source material uses a specific term, financial warlord. What do they mean by that?
As defined in the source, it refers to actors could be political, could be private, who allegedly engineer or just exploit conflict narratives primarily for financial or political gain, rather than through direct fighting. It's about profiting from the story of conflict.
And regulators don't stop this.
The sources suggest it's difficult. Trades are often structured legally, proving intent for insider trading is hard, and political connections can offer protection. The system has loopholes, according to the material.
Okay, and back in Israel, the sources claim this focus on Iran helps domestically too, beyond just rallying support.
Yes, by silencing internal dissent. The argument presented is that when the country is constantly framed as facing an existential risk, it becomes much harder to criticize the leadership or specific policies. Doing so can be portrayed as unpatriotic or dangerous.
It unites people through fear, essentially.
That's the dynamic described in the sources.
And the sources offer a really cynical take on peace, don't they?
They do. The perspective presented is that actual peace, or even just reduced tension, would remove the financial incentive for many of these actors. Lower defense spending, maybe more stable oil prices. That directly threatens the profit models described as being dependent on crisis.
What about hedge funds? How do they fit in, according to the source?
The material suggests they can profit by sophisticated trading strategies, getting ahead of market moves triggered by geopolitical events or speeches. Some might even fund research trying to predict or influence conflict cycles for financial advantage.
And selective intelligence leaks are mentioned.
Yeah, the sources raise the possibility that intelligence might sometimes be leaked strategically. Not the whole picture, just bits to justify an action or create a media frenzy that allows those with advanced knowledge to profit from the resulting volatility.
Okay, and throughout all this, the sources keep stressing the IAEA findings.
Correct. No public evidence cited in IAEA reports, according to these sources, shows Iran is actually close to building a bomb. No confirmed weaponization program. That's a constant refrain in the material provided.
So why don't Western leaders challenge Netanyahu's claims more forcefully, according to the sources?
Politics, mainly. The sources point to the potential political cost, alienating influential pro-Israel lobbies, donors, voters, especially in the U.S., where there's often strong bipartisan support on this issue. It's presented as a political calculation.
The sources touch briefly on the impact on young people in the region.
Yeah, it's a sad point. They argue that generations inherit this climate of fear, instability, and lack of economic opportunity, while the elites allegedly profiting from it often, according to the sources, send their own kids elsewhere to study and build lives away from the potential fallout.
Does the source material offer any solutions? How to dismantle this system they describe?
It offers some general ideas. More transparency in government dealings and finance, support for genuinely independent media, better protections for whistleblowers, and ultimately increased public awareness and accountability through democratic processes. The fundamental problem they highlight, though, is profound.
Which is?
The erosion of trust, fueling division, making global cooperation harder, and, maybe worst of all, turning war and the threat of war, humanity's biggest failing, arguably into what the sources describe as just another business model.
That really does tie together the political, the financial, and the human cost laid out in these sources.
It certainly presents a comprehensive, if critical, perspective based on the material we reviewed.
Okay, so let's quickly recap the perspective presented in this source material we've explored today. We looked at the source's timeline of Netanyahu's warnings about Iran. very consistent over decades.
Right, and the strategic goals the sources attribute to that narrative, consolidating domestic power, regional positioning, blocking diplomacy, leveraging fear.
Then the really striking part, the alleged financial benefits detailed in the sources for defense contractors, energy speculators, political
And
insiders.
the significant real-world costs discussed in the material. Diplomatic fatigue, potentially empowering Iranian hardliners, risking arms races, and even edging closer to actual conflict.
This deep dive into the sources you provided, it really does show the complexity that can lie beneath the headlines, doesn't it?
Absolutely. According to the perspective in these texts, understanding these different layers, the politics, the alleged financial motives, is pretty crucial for making sense of things.
Definitely. And the sources leave us with a final, quite provocative thought, something to mull over as you see news about these kinds of geopolitical tensions. The material really challenges us to look past the surface threat and ask, who, according to these sources, truly stands to gain from the perception of danger? And what's the ultimate price we all pay when, as this material suggests, fear itself becomes a kind of global business?
Something to think about for sure.